All right, my lovely folks, are y'all good if I go ahead and hit the record button so that it's going? Oh, maybe if I turn off my mute.
So the tabletop game? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Maybe that's the game in Space Talk. Sorry.
All right, I'm gonna admit people at 2 o'clock. All right.
Perfect.
Thank you.
All right.
Yeah.
Oop. All right. And you're recording. You're all good to go. Sweet. I'm gonna mute myself and get out of your hair.
All right. All right, I'll just give everybody a moment to come in. It looks like we have a few people still arriving. And then in a couple of minutes, I will get started. All right. I have never done a virtual conference presentation before, so if anything seems strange, feel free to flag me down. Yeah. All right. Okay, in about 1 more minute, we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, here we go. So this is When Print Meets Digital, Digital Literacy Initiatives and Library Exhibits for Students. So specifically, I find print a really valuable sort of final outcome or final product for students that can really drive digital learning outcomes. However, I took this a little bit further during the 2023 to 2024, this previous academic year, by ending up doing these print library exhibits. And so I ended up working with two instructors to produce two separate exhibits in actually two different exhibit spaces in the library. And while I historically have used print a lot because a couple of my biggest areas of my own personal expertise are in uh, graphic design, 2D composition, and also in uh, goodness, and in that sort of, oh, and in data visualization. So those things really mesh what I can offer. Of course, like everybody, I also do a lot of audio stuff, and there are additionally some video projects that come through. All right, so I find that it can be pretty difficult to have an outcome for students, a product for students that is something beyond, okay, we put it in a file or possibly we present them in class and that's it. However, students seem to respond really well when there are products or ability to display work that goes above and beyond just submitting it to the instructor. Now, I also found there to be a large benefit to my relationships with my coworkers, and I had a lot of collaborations with colleagues in my unit that really benefited my space and, well, myself professionally, which I'm going to go into in a moment. I work in access services for context. So let's see, a little bit about my space that kind of highlights why I focus so much on collaboration in spaces. I work at the University of New Mexico, and I run a space called the Adobe Creative Commons. We are an Adobe Creative campus, and so technically the Adobe Creative Commons is a collaboration between IT and the library. However, I am the sole dedicated staff member to the Adobe Creative Commons, and in general, space and staffing support, particularly now that our student workers run through the library, comes via the library. We tend to get more equipment, software, and licensing support from IT. So this is the lobby of the library. You can see kind of to your right, this beautiful sort of cabinet. And that is what I ended up using to host the second library exhibit that I'll be going over. If you look straight ahead, you can see vaguely some triangles on the wall, and that is sort of the open or more collaborative area of my space. I also have a classroom, which if you squint, you can see just to the right where there's green paint on the walls. My classroom only holds 10 to 12 people, so it's not necessarily good for example, showing a film, especially not in a way that would be more publicly accessible. So then let's see, what else? Like many folks, I've heard from so many of you that people are like, patrons in particular, like, I don't know where to find your space. Despite being actually visible from the lobby, and despite the fact that you have to pass the main service / reference desk on your left-hand side in order to get there, nobody can find my space. I don't know. It's a mystery. I also have no dedicated budget for exhibits, film showings, or anything like that. So I do actually now have a staff member who is working with me on more or less a 0.5 basis. However, this is relatively new and also only on the patron facing side. When I work with classes, that's all me. Additionally, I have found that classes are a huge driver of getting students into our space. Also, students, although they do need help with software and hardware, I find that those moments of connection and building trust really happen when we teach concepts and sort of, although I don't love this term, soft skill type stuff. Now, that makes collaborations and spaces, especially spaces that can help me sort of distribute more knowledge about the Adobe Creative Commons, which I'm going to refer to from here on as the ACC. Really, really valuable. I really couldn't do everything that I do if I didn't have my eye out for that sort of thing. So let's just explore my space a little bit more. The photos at the top are sort of our open area, and also the bottom left. You can see we have some audio booths, we have a bunch of desks. We actually have a wall of computers that's not visible here. It's one powerful PC, one regular PC, a Mac, and a docking station. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the interior of our classroom, which is a little bit bigger than this photo makes it look, but not much. So there was a new library exhibit space that was getting put together in our Learning Commons. Our Learning Commons is a huge space where, we basically have the tables and the comfy seating. So when students come to study together in the library, they pretty much always go, or I should rather say that it's an incredibly popular space and students are there constantly. So much so that when I was setting up this first exhibit, I had to continually put up a little sign that said, "Exhibit in progress, please don't sit here at this booth." And if I didn't get there, right as soon as the library was opening, half the time, someone was already sitting there. Now, this space was new. A coworker of mine, and we'll get a better image of the library exhibit space when I talk a little bit more about the exhibit itself. But a coworker of mine got the sort of museum style hangers installed. You can clip different cords, clear or wire to them, and then hang posters, images that are large scale from that. We now have snap-on frames, which have standardized sizes. And through this process, we discovered that standardized sizes are super, super helpful, particularly if you're having a student-led project. Now, I had been talking for a while with my coworker about what sort of thing might be a pilot program for this new library exhibit space. And specifically, my coworker was really looking to have somebody from Access Services, or at least from in the library, really steward this space so that it could come together as a very high level, very well designed item, especially early on. Now, at the same time, I had been discussing with an instructor that I had worked with for a while the possibility of how we might release some data that she and some others had gathered over the past year. UNM has this thing called Grand Challenges, which are groups that get put together and funded to do research and approaches for different sort of high level important issues. And this professor had been working on what was then the basic needs in higher ed Grand Challenge. And so they had gone to every higher education institute in New Mexico and done a basic needs study on food and housing security for students, faculty, and staff. This professor really wanted her students, and the class was in the Honors College on Human Rights, really wanted her students to take this data, put it together, and put it out into the world somehow. And I agreed that this can be a very powerful opportunity for students. So I saw a great opportunity to mesh those two things, and also, in addition to benefiting my coworker, benefit myself by having the support of my coworker. And my coworker has experience in museum and library exhibits. So having her expertise and collaboration was invaluable. We started out, well, I may as well show some of the photos now. So there are two walls, catty corner from each other. This photo doesn't demonstrate the layout great, but it is fairly good about the photos themselves. And when we began, the students were determining everything except for the actual hanging apparatus, which was a surprising amount of work. If you have a new wall exhibit space like this, I highly recommend the snap-on frames, or at least a standardized size that gets rigorously tested. One of the biggest problems that we had is that if you bump these frames, large posters will either be askew or because they're magnets, completely drop the poster, which is, as you can imagine, really not optimal. Despite that, we had this poster up from November 2023 to, I believe, March 2024. So that's how long the exhibit was up. And I heard a few students wanting to know more about it, requesting things. A lot of people looked at it. Those flyers on the table in front of the exhibit were, I believe, designed by another UNM student. Although maybe those were the ones the students in the class designed. There were many, many posters. Now, so starting out, the exhibit was meant to be very, very student oriented, or student driven rather. And so the students were split into 4 groups that the professor determined, which was sort of an introduction area, and that's on the far left, an area that was technically the title group, but was more about more qualitative data and the overall context for the reasons why this data is important. So this image isn't close enough to really show, but those green boxes there on that center photo are actual quotes from people in the qualitative section talking about how hunger impacts their daily lives. And we shall see if I have more photos. However, learning how to navigate communication with students on a project this complex was interesting. And so every single group had at least one color set that they were using, but certain groups had 2. So in the end, I discussed color with my coworker in the library, and we selected yellow, green, and blue, this sort of yellow, green, teal, and blue fading there so that it both stood out against the blue and yellow walls and was harmonious with each other fully so that any color could be selected when things were necessary. So you can see the first poster on that right-hand image uses that teal, but it also pulls from the yellow. And the reason for that is because they wanted to have yellow for New Mexico. Now, the yellow font is not super visible in this photo, but it was reasonably visible in person. So as the project progressed, it was an enormous amount of work, but the students really, many of whom were doing graphic design and also large group long-term projects for the first time, gained enormous knowledge in project management, graphic design, tools. InDesign and Illustrator were both used for this project, and many students who had never touched the tools before walked away with a lot of confidence in them. And even the students who hadn't reported feeling more confident and looking forward to using them in future classes. These students spent lots of time in the tools. The whole project started towards the beginning of the semester and wound on to the first or second week of November. So this was maybe close to a half a semester, 8-week project. And so to me, this project was hugely successful in terms of giving the students skills of using these tools, skills of learning how to print using these tools. There were maybe, depending on the poster, anywhere from 2 to 6 printings, testing out different colors, testing out different sizes, and testing out different formatting, which, if you've never done a print project from digital tools before, is surprisingly difficult to get it right. And as you can see, there are certain things that, when it comes from the transfer from digital to physical, could be improved and also standardized between the posters. So for example, the students ended up deciding on a very simple sort of color frame around the individual posters to both indicate which sort of area of the exhibit they were in. You know, this one's data visualization, blue is solutions, etc. And you can see that the earlier posters, so for example, this first one, the yellow one, food and housing insecurity defined, the wood is actually right on top of the top and the bottom of the yellow box. Whereas for the smaller ones, it was actually easier to migrate that box to the outside because we just trimmed off the excess, allowed for extra margins, and then we're able to put the wood slats inside that box, which, in my opinion, looks better, looks more cohesive, and takes into consideration the hanging apparatus in this. And so, in my opinion, many people, if they do use this in their real life, they are going to have to think about how it's going to work. So for example, let's say there's a STEM student who was in this class. I think many of them were in the humanities, but we'll just take that example. And they decide to do a research poster. Of course, you're going to have to think about how the research poster is going to be physically presented in the space. Now, of course, doing a huge exhibit like this is much more complicated because you're thinking about not just the individual poster, but also how each poster interacts with each other. And these hanging apparatus were fairly complicated. Additionally, you can see how, from a design standpoint, it's very strong to have the different sizes. From a technical standpoint, in terms of the hanging apparatus, deciding sizes, well, from a non-technical standpoint, deciding sizes from a graphic design and project management standpoint was rough. From a technical standpoint, not every size worked equally. And you can see that middle poster on the left-hand side has a gap between the slats because the larger slats were not actually large enough to hold up that poster. The one that gave me the most headaches was that first one on the left-hand side. It was heavy enough that it kept slipping from the hanging apparatus. So yeah, I recommend that if you do an exhibit, you test out your apparatus and also just get standardized stuff that's really sufficient. But back to our example of a student with this poster, they'll have already done all of that. So they can think about things like, how do the individual pieces within their research poster work with each other? So over the course of that, my library coworker and I worked together very closely. And as things began to be printed, began to be wrapped up, she gave me things like, here, you should suggest to the students to adjust this or adjust that, and just noticing very, very small details, like that has an outline that shouldn't be there. And so having that support, having a second set of eyes to think about, sort of the library facing goals, making a really great exhibit that was going to entice general patrons, it would have been a totally different experience if I hadn't had that support. And I'm not sure I would have completed it in the time frame that we had. My colleague helped me do an enormous amount of hanging, which might seem like it would be relatively simple, but really wasn't. Trying to balance posters while also trying to balance yourself on a ladder is an exciting experience. So we can take a closer look at some of these items. We decided to reverse out the title, which you can see is gold with white lettering on sort of the middle third on the right-hand side. That title is The Human Rights of College Students, a Statewide Study, and it actually was decided very, very late in the development. Here we can see it a little bit better. And then this is a closer image of the data visualization and solution setup. The data visualization, frankly, the entire project could have been data visualization, and that would have been enough. And you can see here, the frames actually did slip a little bit. And then on the right-hand side, that's the solutions area. And there was a lot of discussion on who the solutions would be framed around. There was a lot of pushing of SNAP, that sort of thing. And so one of the best parts of this project was, since it was, a UNM Grand Challenge, we really got to see it as being interlinked with sort of UNM's goals and vision, which meant that I didn't have to be quite so careful in deciding which items were or weren't going to be presented in the exhibit. Okay, okay, so that was the first project. And so for a little bit more context, about 30 students worked on that project. And then that was also a large collaboration between me and my colleague, who felt this was a very successful pilot, but now seeks out largely non-student driven projects. Although we are looking at a higher level graphic design students to come in and possibly do some additional work. I would do this again, but I would have much, much, much more of a framework for doing it. And now that I've done it, I have quite a few ideas on what sort of things I would have for the framework. I would have, among other things, standardized sizes, those same colors, I would keep them. The fonts that we selected, I would keep those as well. Let's see. And I would have, although we put together a document that was quite good about museum style exhibits, exhibits where you look, especially hung exhibits like this, and how to determine sort of a story that flows through the whole exhibit. I think I would also give a little bit more guidance on what that might look like. All right. And as far as informing patrons coming in about my space, this was fairly successful because we had so many students coming and asking questions. So many being relative. I think I had maybe 4 or 5 different questions about it. So then that was pretty successful as far as student learning outcomes go. I thought it was extremely successful. And so I had another instructor who knew about the previous project and approached me and wanted to do an exhibit of her own. So this instructor was a Latin American studies instructor. And what we did for this one was, rather than have one full sort of cohesive exhibit, we actually had individual posters. So the students developed their own individual research posters, and there were 2 to a cabinet that were then placed inside, and they were hung with double-sided tape. So the one on the right-hand side is actually not one of the posters that they used. It's not even actually in there. I just photoshopped that as a visual idea of what might work. The students had posters that focused on different aspects of Latin American culture and history, from clothing to food to, I think one student focused on migration and economics. All told, I believe there were 8 posters, and then there was one bigger poster that explained the project itself. Now, the project was actually that the students were creating learning activities for an OER textbook. These were undergraduate students, and the OER textbook is being developed by a professor and graduate students. Now, as far as this goes, this was so much easier to hang in, but it also was seen as hugely valuable among my coworkers, because prior to hanging these posters, the items that had been in these cabinets were very old and often outdated. There was one that described a program that we used to have where that campus police ran, where people could get an escort home, especially late at night, if they lived on campus, or I think also to their vehicle. In any case, that program has not been around in years and is not currently in existence, and yet this poster was still there. So having this item that was more interactive and fresh and new was seen as very exciting by my coworkers, and we were very hopeful that folks coming into the library would see this and engage with it and feel like the space was more energized. I would say that the biggest problem with this one is that there wasn't sufficient context on each of the posters about how they related to the OER textbook and sort of, what it all meant. Why do we care about this information? Why is it important and relevant? Now, that said, the students really worked hard to polish their posters and felt that it was very, very important. And this was to, in my opinion, a higher degree than the student group who didn't put up a physical poster and just did a class presentation. In particular, one of the metrics that I use for that is that I had multiple students working late and meeting with me individually to continue to further their posters. One thing I would say to anyone looking to do an exhibit, especially a print exhibit, is that not everything will be ready at the same time, and it will take longer than you think it will take, which is just sort of the rule, I think, in creative technology work, or any creative work. However, I will note that it was extremely helpful in both cases because not every student group or student individual is going to be ready at the same time. This seems to just be a generalized rule of thumb, at least at UNM. And the fact that things were going up in stages made it possible to be more flexible about that rather than needing it all at the same time. All right, so let's see. So I found the outcomes and results to be really successful from both of these. I fully intend to continue doing exhibits throughout the library in the future. I think one of the biggest things that I heard and observed in students is that having a tangible result that, it's one thing to print off a poster and hand it to your professor. It's another thing entirely to print off a poster and then hang it for the entire university to stare at for 1 to 6 months. And so I saw a lot more buy-in from students in the classes where we had these exits. As far as collaboration and outreach went, one, I did have, I would say that I didn't have a whole lot of outreach from the Latin American exhibit. I mean, not outreach, students reaching out to me about the Latin American exhibit and being like, hey, this says something about the ACC. What is that? What's the story with this exhibit? What's the story with your space? Whereas the human rights exhibit, much more so. However, I think that may be due to students sitting in that space and having the opportunity to just sort of stare at those posters in a way that they don't. Those posters are still up, the Latin American exhibit. Have an opportunity to observe in a place that they're just passing through. Now, as for collaboration, this benefited me. First of all, the collaboration that I did in the large new exhibition space with my colleague was super helpful, very fantastic. We both benefited from it. And we continue to work closely on a number of projects today, which was one of my goals was to create those relationships with my coworkers, since I am the only Adobe Creative Commons full-time staff member. Additionally, so the building manager had to give me the keys for those cabinets, and this project was widely discussed in my unit, which I heard from a lot of folks really helped them get a better understanding of what I do and how I provide both services in terms of tech lending, software support, and a more classroom focused or topics focused kind of thing. So that was very beneficial to me because as somebody who works very independently by nature of the structure, I no crimes. I was able to create these more robust relationships and understanding with my unit coworkers. And so that is pretty much what I have for the presentation portion. Do folks have questions, or are there photos that you'd like to see? I have additional photos, anything like that. If I don't hear from you, I might also throw the question back at you, which is what sort of products, if you do classroom support, or if you don't and you just have a support desk, do you see getting produced? Do you see getting looked at? Do you see as being valuable? Yes, so my colleague whose name is Marcy Botwick wrote up a guide for setting up a gallery space. It was 5 pages, quite simple. Um, and I'm not quite sure what you mean by following any leads. She and I discussed some more specifics, and the professor had, for this first one, and the professor had a lot of ideas in that one. And for the second one, we looked at the space, we decided what was possible, which was 8 posters, and then made some decisions based on that. Does that answer the question? I'm happy to share that guide if anyone wants to email me and ask for it. Um, I'll have to ask Marcy if that's all right, because I know that's still very much in development, but I found it extremely valuable. Yeah. Um, and I Me too. One of the biggest things is that actually I didn't mention is that one of the goals of our space is to show student work. And so we have a website where we show quite a bit of student work, but I'm not sure anyone really ever gets to that page. And so having these opportunities to showcase that stuff, I find really valuable. And I think I'd also like to do an exhibit that's like, here's what students have made in the ACC as I continue to gather more generalized student work. I have one student who takes the most incredible research grade photos of birds, for example. And if you do want to like chat with me in a more intensive basis about doing that or the approach or some things that I wish I'd done differently, um, you're welcome to send me an email. I'm just going to put my email in chat. Absolutely. One thing I should mention as far as budget goes is that I didn't do the printing for either of these. Um, the Honors College has its own dedicated printer that the instructor actually scheduled the class in so that we could do printing during class time. The Latin American Studies class, the instructor had a specific budget for the class to do some printing. As it turns out, uh, we do have a large scale printer in the library, which I knew. It's in the Center for Southwest Research, but I apparently have the right to use that. So that's very exciting for future exhibits. All right, do we have any other questions? Okay. I'm just going to read this off. I never thought of putting student work on display within the library where the students are. We keep those exhibits in a case in the front of the library. Thanks. Oh yeah, that makes sense. And having the exhibit right there in the student space, like I said, it really yielded a lot of interactivity. I had one student message me and actually ask, hey, when is the presentation going to be? And I said, well, there's no presentation per se. And then I, was able to refer that student to all of the connected stuff. Thanks, William. Okay, well, if we don't have any additional questions, and feel free to throw them in chat if you do, then I'm just going to talk a little bit about one of the things that I'm hoping to do in the spring. I want to do an exhibit. This was brought to me, another possible collaboration with a coworker. And she came to me and she said, hey, I'd like to do an exhibit around student experiences in the library. And why that would be relevant to my space is because one of the ideas that she had was recording video clips of them. So the idea that I have in mind is putting up posters that have a quote from the student and an image of their face, and then a QR code and a link to the actual video. I'm always thinking of ways to make this sort of thing more interactive, and also I'm a big fan of sort of hybrid digital print models as well. And so I'm hoping that that'll be functional, but I'll have to see, and I'm not sure how to measure this yet, but I'd like to see how much students really do go through and watch the videos, because if they do, then that provides a great opportunity for me to showcase video in the future. At current, although I could play it on loop in the classroom, we've got a gentle 5-minute warning. Then I don't think that would be particularly successful. People do sometimes wander into the classroom by themselves. I leave it open as a general study space. If it's not being used for special projects, which have gone up significantly since I've worked more with my coworkers, which I think is great. I love seeing the space utilized. But in general, I'm just looking into more ways to expand the types of media that I can share. Okay, and we've got about 3 minutes left. Oh, Monica says, we do something like this with whiteboards and stickies, but very informal. Oh, that's neat. Well, Monica, maybe sometime we can chat about what you do exactly, because I have a lot of whiteboards and I am always interested in ways to use them to make the space more interactive or interesting. Thanks. Okay, any last questions or thoughts? Otherwise, I think I'll let us have a couple extra minutes and then head over to the next session. Thanks, everyone.
Great job, Dana.
Thank you.
All right. I'll see you over at the wrap up.
See you there.
Bye.